Buon pomeriggio, benvenuti e benvenute a questa conferenza dal titolo Come un chiodo ha costruito il mondo. E naturalmente benvenuta all'ingegnera Roma Agrawal, che ringrazio per la sua presenza insieme alla casa editrice Bollati Boringhieri. Mi muovo adesso sull'inglese, dato che il resto della conferenza la condurremo in inglese e come penso sappiate vi è la possibilità di traduzione simultanea, della qual cosa ringrazio l'interprete. So, good afternoon. I'm Alvise Mattozzi, sociologist here at Politecnico, where I teach social studies of science and technology. I'm really honored to be here to introduce you Roma Agrawal and their talk, How a Nail Has Built the World. Roma Agrawal is a structural engineer and an author. As a structural engineer, she is known for having worked, among other buildings, on the Shard, a very high London skyscraper designed by Renzo Piano. As an author, she has published, built the hidden stories behind our structures in 2019, which was translated in Italian as Costruire, le storie nascoste dietro le architetture, still published by Bollati Boringhieri. Then a version of this book for younger readers called How Was That Built? And finally, Nuts and Bolts, 7 Small Inventions That Changed the World in a Big Way, which is translated by Bollati Boringhieri as Dadi e Bulloni, 7 piccole invenzioni che hanno cambiato parecchio il mondo, which will be the ground for today's talk. I do not want to say much about the book in order to do not spoil the talk, but just underline a few things that somehow I found interesting. So I want somehow to share my excitement and interest for the book with you before leaving the floor to Roma. So, as you can understand from the title of the book, 7 Small Inventions, she explores and clarifies basic technologies, which have a long history, but however are still relevant today and are part of most of the technology we use in our everyday life. So, by focusing on these 7 small technologies, she allows us to get into our everyday lives and into our everyday practices, and to understand how these technologies are related, and contribute to build our everyday life and practices, but also how they are related, they create connection among us. So somehow her attempt is clearly to simplify, to let us understand our world, which is technologically filled with a lot of technologies, by simplifying, by getting to these very specific small technologies. But at the same time, she shows not only that these technologies have various connections among themselves within a device, within a smartphone, for instance, or within a microphone, but also how these small technologies are connected to many other relations that are not only technological. And this is, for me, that I'm a sociologist, of course, the interest of the book. And she's very keen in showing, I mean, the contribution of engineers and craftsmen in developing these technology and in designing them, paying a lot of attention to the role of women, for instance, and taking into account, I mean, all the different ways in which technologies can be used, that, as we know, are not always, let's say, progressive and positive. So I don't want to steal time from her. I mean, you're not here from me, but from Roma Agrawal. So I just want to conclude by reading the first line of the conclusion of the book, which somehow resonate perfectly with the idea of Biennale Tecnologia. As you probably know, the motto of Biennale Tecnologia is Tecnologia è umanità. Technology is humanity. And as you will see, I mean, this motto resonates a lot with what Roma Agrawal writes. So, engineering tells us an intrinsically human story. That's one of the things I found exciting about it when I lived in New York as a little kid and began looking at skyscrapers surrounding me. At first, of course, I was just bowled over by the sheer scale and drama of this construction. But gradually, my curiosity deepened. This structure, made from brick, stone, and concrete, were, I realized, evidence of us, our needs and wants, how we dreamed up and then created solutions, how we went on to organize towns or cities, leading to the shape of how we live our daily lives. From cars to computers to coffee machines, engineering makes our humanity what it is. It's how we interact with each other and with the planet. So, thank you, Roma, for being here, and thank you, Bolati Boringhieri, for collaborating in organizing this. I leave the floor to Roma, and then, of course, we will have a chance to talk all together.
Grazie. Buongiorno, ciao. Thank you so much for having me here today in Italy. And thank you for coming to a lecture theatre on a sunny spring day to listen to a talk about engineering. So I know that all of us are going to be friends, because that's the kind of thing I would do. Instead of sitting in the sun, I would be listening to a lecture on engineering. So thank you so much for being here with me. I just thought before I start talking about the main topic, I will tell you a little bit more about myself and my career. So I worked as a structural engineer for nearly 15 years. And as Alvarez mentioned in the introduction, the project that I was best known for is the Shard in London, which is the tallest skyscraper in Western Europe. And of course, it was designed by an Italian, so it must be the best. Yeah? Yeah. I never got to meet Renzo Piano, but I saw him like that, a bit further away. And I worked with his associates and so on, and I loved working with that team. So as a structural engineer, if you've never heard of what structural engineers do, in very simple terms, we make sure that buildings and bridges stand up. So I can invite you to look up, and you will see some trusses, these beams which are going across and holding up the lights, and there's some triangles that you can see. And I love the triangle shape. I even have a tattoo of a triangle on my finger because it's a very strong shape. So these are the kind of things that I would do as a structural engineer. And I've given you 3 examples of projects that I was lucky enough to work on. The Shard is on one side. In the middle is a footbridge in Newcastle. That was my first project. And then finally was a sculpture. It was temporary in Covent Garden, which is a very historical area. And so we weren't allowed to put any foundation or anchors into the ground. So as engineers, we had to come up with a way to make this safe. You can see that people can actually climb to the top of that structure, so we don't want it to fall down. So I love that example because it brings together engineering and art. And sometimes we forget that these 2 things come together. These are some photographs of me a very long time ago. I think my daughter must be this age now. And I used to love wearing my dad's clothes when I was a child. Anybody else like that as well? Yes? Yeah? Okay. So I was wearing my dad's suit. My dad was an electrical engineer, and he used to work as an engineer in America, so I spent my first 6 years in America. And I loved playing with, we call them bristle blocks or stickle bricks. Is that familiar? Or Lego, of course. And I loved these things. So you might think, if you look at these pictures, that Roma always knew that she wanted to be an engineer from the time she was very, very young. But actually, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And after living in America for 6 years, I moved to India. And I was in India for 10 years. And I think that's an important part of my history and identity to mention, because unlike in the UK, in India, to study engineering, maths, accounting, medicine, any kind of technological, scientific career is very much encouraged. In the UK, it's kind of the opposite. So I wanted to study physics and maths, which is what I did in the UK. So I did a degree in physics, and later I did a master's in structural engineering and became a structural engineer. But it wasn't really until I was finishing my physics degree that I thought, oh, I can actually become an engineer. What I liked about engineering is that it's applying maths and physics to the real world, and you can make things. And I wanted to be able to see things, touch, what have I made? I want that legacy. And so engineering gave me that for a long time. Most recently now, these are just some fun photos of my last 40 years of life. You can see me at the top of the Shard in my hard hat. I'm very scared of heights. That's why I'm standing a bit far. I don't like looking down. Nearly 15 years after my footbridge was built, first of all, it's still standing, very important, but I was awarded an honorary degree by the university who was my client. So that was really nice. And if any of you are familiar with very British culture, there's a quiz show called University Challenge, and I was on that. But for the special Christmas one, which is much easier than the normal quiz. So I've had a great time going to tell people about engineering, because in the UK, for sure, maybe parts of Western Europe, we don't really understand what engineers do, how exciting it is, how creative it is. And particularly, we don't get enough women and young girls interested in engineering. So I like to go and inspire people to consider engineering in a new way. So my latest book is Nuts and Bolts, Dadie Bologna. I must pronounce that not very well. And it's about 7 small inventions that change the world. And I wrote this just when the pandemic started. Okay, so our big world became very small. We were stuck in our little place. I was in an apartment, and I had a small baby. I'm going to tell you more about her later. And I started to think, I have written books about huge things, like the biggest man-made structure in Western Europe. That's kind of the things that I was writing in my first book. And I said, but what are the small things? If I break the Shard down and look at the individual pieces, what actually is coming together to make this very big thing? So I started thinking about my blender, maybe my washing machine, dishwasher, maybe even just my furniture, maybe a skyscraper, maybe a tunnel. And I came up with this list of 7 items which I think are the most fundamental pieces of engineering, without which none of the complex things could exist. Okay, so if I tell you about all 7, we would be here for 3 hours. I'm not going to do that to you. So I picked 3 of them. So today I will tell you the story of the nail, magnet, and lens. Okay, and I would love to have lots of questions at the end. I'll make sure there's time for questions. You can ask me about the other ones, or if you have any other questions as well. So I thought a lot about what we did to make things a million years ago, 2.5, 3 million years ago. And if you think about the most basic stone tool, it's one object. Then we made it sharp, still one object. We might change its shape, one object. We might try and make some structures with branches, with wood, and maybe tie it together with vines. But these vines are organic, and so they decay and they break, and you have to keep replacing it. So the complexity of the technology and in the engineering that we could make was very, very basic until we could join things together in a strong way, in a way that would last. And that's why I think that the nail is one of the most fundamental and most revolutionary pieces of engineering. But I think all of us take the nail for granted, and sometimes I ask people to put up their hand, like, do you think the nail is an extraordinary piece of engineering? And maybe 1 or 2 people will put their hand up, but after 5 minutes, I think most of you would agree. 5 minutes with me. So I could tell you the story of the nail in 3 different ways, okay? Because this is what I love to do. I love to tell stories about engineering. I could tell you the story of materials. I could tell you the story of how it's manufactured. Or I can tell you the story of people. And all of these stories are completely valid. So the nail can be such a simple object, but its story is so complex. So I'm going to probably mix between the 3 as I tell you why I think the nail is so wonderful. So nails really originated when we learned how to play with metal. Because a nail needs a sharp point, but it needs to be strong, so that if you hammer it, it doesn't deform too much, and it goes inside the wood or the other material that you want. So there's very specific requirements that you need in order to create a successful nail. And metal is the correct material to achieve that. The problem is gold and silver, which were the early materials that humans discovered, were very soft. So it was really when we started playing around with copper that we thought, oh, we can do something quite clever with this. We can create a sharp point, and we can hammer it in, and we can join things together. So some of the earliest examples of nails are going back around 5,000 to 6,000 years in ancient Egypt. And the ancient Egyptians were creating incredible things out of copper and later bronze, and nails were one of them. So if you think about the ships that they were using, or maybe some of the, like the wagons or the chariots, they were using nails to join the wood together. So what's interesting to me then is that bronze is stronger than copper, but bronze is a mix of copper and tin. So this is where like geopolitics comes into play, because copper and tin are not found in the same place. So people were using bronze for a few hundred years, but at some point they had to stop because bronze became very expensive because there were wars or there was unrest in the Middle East. So they couldn't bring the 2 materials together to make bronze, and that's why people stopped using bronze. So there's a very interesting reason as to why this material was not used for a long time. After that, we went to iron, And iron was used for a very long time. Iron is a very good material. It's a little bit on the softer side, but it's still a wonderful material. And so many structures all around the world, the Eiffel Tower, our early railways, were made with iron. But the original Iron Age started in southern India and what is now Sri Lanka, much before it started in Europe. And so what I love about that story is that the Indians, the South Asians, were creating this wonderful iron, and they were exporting it to the Romans. So if you have, I'm sure, learnt about the ancient Roman civilizations, if you dig a little bit in there, maybe you already know this, but if you dig a little bit deeper, the iron that the Romans were using to create Roman nails was often made out of this Indian iron. And we think of patents and protecting our intellectual property like as quite a modern thing, but the Indians told the Romans, no, I'm not going to tell you how we make our iron. If you want this, you need to come to us. So there was some protection about the formula for how this metal was made. Now, all of this time, we were creating these metals by hand. Okay, so you can see a photo of me. I went to a forge in England, which has been running continuously since the 1850s. And it really feels like I have entered the 1850s when you go inside this forge. And the forger taught me how to make nails. Most people go to him to learn how to make some fancy things, and I called him up and I said, I want to make a nail. And he said, okay, that's a bit strange, but we can do that. And it took me like 2 hours to make 3 nails. Really long time. And my arm was hurting quite a lot. The amount of effort you need to create these nails is really something. The principle is that you heat up the steel, I was using steel, to a very high temperature so that it's like orange, and then you hit it, and you turn it, and you hit it to create the sharp point. Then you create a cut, you break it off, you heat the head, you hit the head, and then you create this kind of a shape. And that is how the ancient Egyptians made their nails, the Indians were making their nails, the Romans were making their nails. And one of the stories that I found, which I loved, was in the 1960s in Scotland. Archaeologists found more than 800,000 Roman nails, which the Romans had, I guess they had to leave Scotland very quickly for some political reason. And they didn't want the local people to have this precious material, which was iron, or the technology of the nail. So they dug a huge pit, they put all the nails inside, and they covered it. And because of the way it was covered, and because the top layer of the nails rusted, the nails underneath that were like fresh and shiny. And so there's this incredible hoard of nails from the Roman time that we only unearthed like a few decades ago in Scotland. So next, I'm going to come a little bit more into the modern era, in the last 200 to 300 years, and industrialization. So I tell the story of a woman called Eliza Tinsley. And she had her husband who ran a business, but he died, and she had young children, and she had to find a way to earn a living to look after her children. So she took over his business, and there were different factories that she had. She expanded the business, and it was mostly a lot of women and children who were manufacturing nails at this point. And in fact, women used to learn how to make nails, and men used to like marrying these women who could make nails because they said, oh, she can earn a bit of extra money. So if there's any single ladies in the audience, maybe you want to learn how to make nails, maybe not. Yeah, you can learn to make nails for fun, not to find some guy. But there was this big culture of children, of women, of men, all coming together to make nails because it was such a precious commodity. So today, nails are so cheap. But when Britain then started colonizing all these different countries, because nails were so expensive at that time, they refused to export the nails to any of their colonies. Now, if you think about North America, who was under British rule, most of their homes are made from wood. That's the natural resource that they have. But the nails were actually the most expensive part of their home. So if an American wanted to move from one home and go move to another home, they used to burn their houses down. Okay, and then from the ashes of their home, they used to collect all the nails, put them in a bag, and take it to the next place and build their next home. That's how precious nails used to be. It's how expensive they used to be. And this practice became so widespread and so bad that the state of Virginia actually passed a law to ban people from burning their houses down. And they were promised that a surveyor would come and have a look, how many nails are you leaving behind, and give you some money instead. Please don't burn the house down, have some cash. You can buy new nails, which I think is extraordinary. Then the Industrial Revolution happened, and then mechanization happened, and we figured out how to mass produce objects. We figured out how to make steel cheaply, and then since then, we are manufacturing thousands of nails a minute in a machine. They are cheap, they're readily available, and actually now I think we take them for granted. But I hope you can see why I think nails are so fascinating. So just to talk about some of the developments of the nails, screws are one development, and they mechanically kind of fix together two things, whereas with a nail, you can pull it and it might come apart. So screws are strong in that sense. Then you can think about rivets, which are these things here. And what they do is they clamp together thin sheets of metal, because a nail can't join metal up. So you have to find a different way to do it. And then the last one is the nut and the bolt, which is almost like a combination of the screw and the rivet. And that's part of why I called my book Nuts and Bolts. I have some bolts still in my house when we were sent samples when we were designing the shard. And I actually spent many months, because the top part of the shard, if you're familiar with the building, is all open exposed steel. And so the architect, the architectural team, wanted to make sure that the nuts and the bolts were all beautifully arranged so that the connections looked amazing. And so I spent a lot of time designing nuts and bolts. At that time, I did not like them very much. I was very fed up with this work. But ultimately, I understood that without this piece of technology that fits in my hand, okay, these are small pieces of technology, something like the shard cannot exist. And that's thanks to the story of the nail. So the next object I will go on to is the magnet. And I think magnets are very magical because they have this force that you can play with where the two things are not even touching, but there's something happening across time and space to allow these forces to move around. And so the story of the magnet that I focused on in my book is about communication. How do we communicate with each other? And so I'm going to tell you the story of some generations of my family, and maybe this will resonate with your own history. So this is a telegram. Is there anybody in the audience that ever sent a telegram? Yeah? A few people. That's wonderful. So my grandfather, this must be in the 1950s to 60s in India, used to correspond with his eldest son, my dad's older brother, who actually moved here to Italy, and he didn't like it. I think too much pizza for him. He needed some spicy food. So he used to send telegrams to my grandfather saying, anxious to return, buy my plane ticket. He wanted money from my granddad to bring him back to India. And my granddad would receive these telegrams and, no, you need to stay there and work and earn some money. Eventually, my grandfather did buy his ticket, and then he moved back to India. So how is the telegram connected to magnetism? And how is the Indian telegraph system, which my grandfather and my uncle used, how is that connected? So during the colonization period of India, there was a Scottish doctor called William O'Shaughnessy, and he came to India and he wanted to create some kind of communication system because the Indians were starting to get a bit like, "Ooh, we don't want these British people here colonizing us." There was some rebellion starting, and the British people said, "We need to communicate across this very big country to stop this problem from happening." So what we had figured out in the 1800s was that electricity and magnetism are very intertwined. They work together. So his idea was, how can I use electricity and magnetism to send some kind of code or message? So if you have pulses of electricity, because the electrical current is changing, it creates a magnetic response. Please don't ask me to explain the physics, because my degree was 20 years ago, and I don't believe any physicist understands how it works. But you can fight with me about this afterwards if there's any physicist here. So with pulses of electricity, this would create magnetism. Initial design that he created was that you hold the wire, and then you get shocked when these pulses come. And depending on how many pulses there are, there's some language. But luckily, he changed the system, and he put a magnetic, or an iron needle. So depending on the pulse, it would flick left or flick right. And then he created a code based on this. A little bit different than Morse code. Morse code, which we may be more familiar with, was the American product. This was the British product. And then he built the first telegraph lines from Calcutta up the kind of northeast side of India. And in the first rebellion for independence that happened in India in 1857, it was Indian people employed by the British Army, and the first thing they did was to go and destroy the telegraph system so that the British couldn't warn in Delhi or in other places, even London, about this uprising. Unfortunately, they still managed to get the message across, and so that rebellion was stopped. And then the British built a telegraph system all over India, all the way to London, so that they could communicate quickly. So what is interesting to me here is that we always talk about engineering and progress, and it's good for people. So my question to you would be, who are the people that this system was good for? Because it certainly wasn't good for the local Indians that were living there. It was used as a tool of oppression, really. Once the British left, then the Indians took over it, and it became one of the biggest used systems in the world for a long time. And it was only a couple of decades ago, that the Indian telegram system was closed. And that's because of the telephone. So my aunt, my dad's older sister, moved to the US in the 1970s as a doctor. And she used to call up India, but she had to book the call one week in advance. 1 week or 24 hours in advance, like quite far in advance. Because the way this old telephone used to work is we're again using electricity to create changes in magnetism, to create a signal that can be transmitted. So if I speak into this, even this microphone probably works the same way. There's something in this microphone that's going to vibrate, because my sound is vibration. That vibration will be hitting some iron or magnetic material. That will create magnetism, which then creates this electrical response, which is going to my colleagues over here, and then that gets, again, transmitted from electricity to magnetism to sound. Okay, so we're still using this magnetism to create this sound. But the problem with this system was that if I want to call up Michele over here, I need a cable from me to Michele. And if Michele wants to call you, then you need another cable here. But we don't have a cable, so I can't call you. So imagine if everybody wanted to call each other in this room, how many cables you would have, and it would become a big mess. So instead, the system that was developed was the exchange. So what happens here is that if this is my exchange here, all of your cables are going to come here, okay? And then you can call me Michele and tell me I want to speak to Alvarez, and I'll say, okay, and I'm going to connect your two cables together, and then you can speak to each other. Then when you finish, I will remove that cable. So we created this central exchange, basically, and that was created by an American man called Stroger, and Stroger was a funeral director, okay? He was the only funeral director in his town in America. Then a new funeral director came to town, and the new funeral director's wife worked at the exchange. So if somebody called saying, I need an undertaker, they meant Stroger, because that's who they know. She said, okay, I'll connect you to my husband, and give him the business. And so Stroger's business was very impacted. And he said, I'm fed up with this. I need to remove the girls from the situation. That was his language, because it was often women who were doing this job of connecting up cables in the exchange. And so he created this system. Now, I don't want to try and explain too much in detail, but that's an electric coil, these are electrical coils, and then they create a magnetic force. So when you used to have those dialing telephones, do you remember which go round? I can see young people nodding. I'm surprised. Say you dial a 3, you go click, click, click. There'll be 3 clicks as it comes back. So 3 electrical pulses would go to this exchange, and this rod would be pushed up 3. Then the next number you dial may be 8, and then there were 10 points in this cylinder, and then that rod would turn around to point number 8, and then it would be automatically connected, so you don't need a person to make the connections. So what my aunt had to do, she lived in New Haven, she used to need a connection in New York, and then New York needed to connect to London, and then London used to connect to Mumbai, and then in Mumbai they would connect it to my grandfather's phone. So there were so many different steps required for cables to be physically connected in order for my aunt to speak to her family back in India. And then finally the story of Takayanagi Kenjiro, who is the Japanese father of the television. And he used magnetism to create the first electronic television. And what he did was use magnetic plates, so the deflecting plates that I've drawn here create magnetism. And then he was shooting electrons between the plates, and depending on the strength of the magnet, this electrons stream would go onto different points in the screen. So you would start from one corner, go across, jump down, go across, jump down, go across. And you would do this so fast that your eye is fooled into seeing a moving picture. So that's how the earliest televisions used to work. So the last story I'm going to tell you, and then we'll have time for questions, is about the lens. And I can see many people in the audience are wearing glasses. And so we know how important the lens we have in front of our eyes is for us every day. So this thing is a great piece of engineering. But how did that come about? This is actually one of the earliest microscopes. And actually, that's just as big as my palm. It's quite a small thing. And it was created by a Dutch textile seller called Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. And he wanted to create this microscope so that he could study the material that he was selling. He wanted to see what the thread count is, how many threads are in there, and wants to close up into that material and look at it. So what he did was that little tiny thing there is like a 2 millimeter glass sphere. So he polished a glass into a sphere, 2 millimeters, really tiny, and then he would look at stuff with this lens. And that was the first recorded use of a microscope. And I said I would talk about my daughter again. So my daughter would not be born. She could not exist without the lens, because I had IVF to have my baby. So to make my child, my egg was taken out, and my husband's sperm was taken out, and then with a needle, which I can't even imagine how small that must be, made out of glass, the embryologist injected that single sperm into the egg to create the embryo. And then that embryo was put back into my body, and then I got pregnant eventually, and I had my daughter. So without this ability to look at these cells of our body and inject one cell into another, my daughter couldn't exist. Now, the interesting story, so if there's any very young children in the audience, you can cover your ears, please. The story is that Antony van Leeuwenhoek started to look at different things under the microscope. So he looked at his tongue, and he saw all the taste buds. He looked at water in a pond, and he saw bacteria and algae. He cut his finger and looked at blood, so maybe he's the first person to see red blood cells. He was also the first person to see sperm. You can ask, why did he decide to do that? I don't know. But he wrote a letter to the Royal Society in London, and he used to write many letters to explain to the other scientists of all the different things he was seeing under the microscope. So this particular letter, which I saw the digital copy, and I translated from Dutch, it says that when he discovered sperm, it wasn't through sin, it wasn't through self-defilement, but it was left over after having coitus with his wife. This is what he says. So he was the first person to see sperm. But it still took over 100 years before we understood that the egg and sperm have to come together in order to create the embryo. It took a very long time. So what does the lens do? Fundamentally, the lens bends light. Okay, so depending on whether you can see well far or see well near, your glasses are going to bend light and help your eyes to focus better so that you can see more clearly. Or it can also magnify things. So we can use this, like I said, magnifying glass to look at sperm or other things. But our understanding of the lens comes from somebody who I did not know about until 3 years ago. So we know about Newton and all the work he did with light, but 700 years before Newton was an Arabic scientist called Ibn al-Haytham. Okay, so he was practicing science during around 1000 AD, when we say that Europe was in the Dark Ages. It was the golden age of Islamic science. And he explained that based on his religious beliefs, he had to question everything around him. He had to question the science before him. And so he was looking at the Greek science and the Roman science and all of this information, and he was the first person to actually explain how the eye can see. Okay, so up to 1,000 years ago, we didn't understand how our eyes sees. We didn't know that our eye and light rays are two completely separate, independent things. I mean, it feels very obvious to us now, but that's not what the scientists thought at the time. And you can see in this picture here, he's got the camera obscura. So he was one that developed that. He is projecting the image of what he can see behind through a pinhole onto the sheet. It's upside down. He explains why this is, because of light rays. And he explained that when two different light rays are crossing each other. There's no interference. He drew a cross-section through the eye and predicted that there's a lens inside the eye. Incredible work. And he wrote a huge book about optics, which Isaac Newton studied 700 years later. But still, we don't know his name. I didn't know it. I had a degree in physics, and I didn't know his name. So I think it's important to know some of these other people. And then I just wanted to quickly share the story of Miriam Mencken. So a couple of hundred years after Leeuwenhoek, she was the one who was doing experiments. So she was working with another scientist, and he was a surgeon, so he would remove the ovarian tissue from women, and she would look at this tissue under the microscope and try and get the eggs out. So she investigated over 1,000 samples, and I think only 45 or 46 samples had the eggs in them, the cells. And then she tried to fertilize the egg in a petri dish. And she finally succeeded after years of doing this very difficult work, and created the first embryo that lived outside of the human body. So she, again, her name is usually lost because we hear about John Rock, who was her boss, but she was really the person that put this together. The funny thing is, when the first time it happened, she was so excited they forgot to take a photograph, and so then they had to do it again. And then they definitely took lots of photographs that time. So just to finish up, why am I interested in this topic? Why are we talking? We're talking about utopia at this conference, like a realistic view of what that might look like. And I think one of the biggest, we know climate problems and climate crisis. One of the big issues is electronic waste. Okay, we throw away, in the UK, we are throwing 24 kilograms of electronic waste per person per year. And it's not that different in the rest of Europe. Norway is more than the UK. I don't know the number for Italy, but I can't imagine it's much different. We are throwing away so much that probably would actually work quite well. And so what I encourage you to do, and what I hope you will take away with you, is just to think about what are the little things in the things you're using that make up the more complex thing. So if your blender might break, get a screwdriver out, dismantle it, have a look. Just see, ooh, okay, I can see an electric motor. I can see some screws holding it together. Think about all the different components that are coming together to create this piece of technology. Maybe you can repair it. Maybe you can get somebody to repair it. But I think it's important that we understand and appreciate how much time, energy, resources goes into producing this one thing. And I say that I'm thankful to so many people that my daughter could be born, but I'm thankful to people all the way to Ibn al-Haytham, 1,000 years ago, even the ancient Greeks, because without all the work that they did over thousands of years, we would not be where we are today with these kinds of technologies. So I would just invite you to be curious and to think about all our pieces of technology a bit more. Think about who were they made for, why were they made, who benefited from it, were people oppressed by it? Because that's still the story today. Our smartphones are taking resources from Africa where people are working in horrible conditions, or where do our clothes come from, and so on. So I would just invite you to be curious as step one. Step two is fix the world, but that's a bit more difficult. So just to remind you, these are my 3 books. 2 are in Italian. Middle one is for children. It's the children's version of Built. So you can find this on the internet. My website is romatheengineer.com. You can send me an email from there through my website if you like, or I'm on Instagram as well. So thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience, and thank you. Can I also say a big thank you to Chiara, who's been translating for me so wonderfully for the last hour.
Grazie. Thank you very much, Roma. I think that even if you didn't read the book, you could appreciate what I was telling you and what she also underlined. So simplifying, choosing these 7 technologies, but then somehow expanding, looking at various relations of which they are part, and various stories of which they are part. And what is all connected to that, our responsibilities. And so thank you very much also for concluding on this issue of repair and waste, which is very important. So I guess we have around 10 minutes for question. We started a bit later, so we have some minutes. I know that there are physicists, there were physicists that you were wondering if there were physicists about knowing about magnetism. I saw them, now probably they left. So, any question?
Do you know mic?
Il microfono è lì? Ah.
And please be comfortable to ask in Italian or
English.
English.
I will translate.
Yeah.
Or
whatever's comfortable for you.
Yeah, I will translate. Yes.
Hello, thank you for the talk, first of all. But going back to your list of these 7 fundamental inventions, I wanted to ask, like a nail, a string, a magnet, these all seem like very simple things, at least in hindsight. But one of them stood out to me, it's the pump. It's a pretty complex assembly usually. So why do you think that one deserves to be on the list of these fundamental inventions? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really, really good question. Very important question. So when I really try to understand what is a pump, it can be anything that moves gases or liquids from one place to another. So even if you think about a bucket on a pulley with a rope, that could be considered a pump. So that is the kind of more towards the fundamental pump. And I start with the most fundamental pump, which is the shaduf, which was used in ancient Egypt, which basically had a long stick, one bucket on one side, and like a bag of sand on the other side, and it was on a frame. And you can imagine it's like a lever, so you can pick up the water and then turn it around and irrigate. But the reason I think the pump was important to include is because for humanity to survive, the pump was so important to get clean water, to take the sewage away, to be able to live in different lands, to be able to grow food. So it felt like a very fundamental thing to me. And then I explore 3 different pumps. One is the heart-lung machine, so the bypass machine, where I spoke to a cardiac surgeon, and he told me that he was once standing next to a woman, her chest was open, no heart, no lungs, but she was alive because there's a pump circulating her blood and keeping it warm and not damaging it. And I talk about the astronauts. We couldn't have gone into space without the pump. And then the final one, which this is why, as a woman engineer, I like to put my perspective. I talked about the breast pump because when I was feeding my baby, I found it really difficult. And I was like, yes, engineering is going to help me because now my husband can feed her as well. So that I did some research on the breast pump, which was very interesting. But thank you for a wonderful question.
Any other? Altre domande? Anche in italiano? Grazie.
Io sono un vecchio ingegnere, come si vede, e ho assistito nel corso della mia lunga vita a questo fatto. Oggi se chiediamo a qualcuno dei giovani che sono qui attorno, o anche meno giovani, chi ha inventato internet, boh, la risposta è boh. Se però chiediamo a qualche vecchio come me chi ha inventato l'aereo, chi ha inventato l'automobile o chi ha inventato il telefono, beh, bene o male un paio di nomi vengono fuori. Bah, questo fa pensare che, cioè, in che modo si è evoluta la tecnologia, vale a dire si è passato da una forma personalizzata ad un inventore, al quale poi certamente ha fatto seguito un brevetto, ad una forma più anonima, nel senso che la collettivizzazione, la messa insieme di elementi, lo scambiarsi le informazioni da una parte all'altra del mondo, ecco, finisce di creare, cioè non c'è più l'uomo dietro all'invenzione, ma c'è un brevetto di una multinazionale. E quindi, ecco, questo mi fa pensare, ecco, che quale può essere lo stimolo per l'uomo di continuare a far lavorare la sua mente, il suo ingegno per creare qualcosa, quando poi il suo contributo non compare da nessuna parte, perché si traduce in un brevetto di una multinazionale. Ecco, questo mi crea un po' di preoccupazione sul fatto che l'uomo possa continuare ad essere stimolato dalle invenzioni e non invece di lasciare questo compito alle macchine e andarsene in vacanza alle Maldive, magari a fare altro. Ecco. Vorrei sentire se c'è qualche commento da parte vostra a queste mie riflessioni. Grazie.
Grazie. He's an engineer and with quite a lot of experience and has seen a lot of changes. And one that is that he has struck is that if you ask to the people today about some inventions, or relevant invention like who invented internet, young people will not know it. So, whereas people of his age will always remember who invented such and such technology. And so, somehow he is noticing that now, today, the profession of engineering is becoming more and more anonymous. I mean, things gets designed by an exchange of information, but there is not anymore the man or the woman behind, but probably just a corporation with a patent. Mm. And so the question is, I mean, why should we keep inventing and moving our mind in inventing stuff, in designing stuff, when our contribution disappear under the patent of a big corporation?
Okay. No, grazie. So I would say that, first of all, as technology gets more and more complicated, that you do need more people with more expertise and different type of expertise to come together to create something. So we know Vitruvius, he was a master builder. He was architect, engineer, everything. But on the Shard, we need lots of people, because I am an expert in structures, somebody else is an expert in mechanical or plumbing or something. We can't, in such a complex world, have everything with one person. So that's one thing to think about. And the second, I would argue that, yes, we knew the one name of the person who invented this or that, but that person has also been working with a lot of people, or different teams, or taken information from somebody, like I gave the example of Newton. is it right that we only know about Newton but not Ibn al-Haytham? So I would say to you that a lot of names have always been anonymous and have been lost and erased. And so now it's a different way of looking at contributions. And in terms of why should we do it? Because it's fun, because it's going to help people, help the world, whatever it might be. I'll give you one quick more example. Marconi radio. He used a device inside that radio called coherer. Do you know who invented the coherer? Maybe not. It was an Indian scientist called Jagdish Chandra Bose. And he was working in colonial India under British rule. And he didn't apply for a patent. So we don't know him in the West. We know Marconi. We don't know Bose. So I would challenge you to say that there are, throughout history, we have lost names and erased names and made people's contribution disappear.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Okay, I guess that, I mean, this last answer was very insightful about many things. So if there are no other questions, I guess that we can close and we can thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roma.
Grazie.
And thank you very much, Bollati Boringhieri. And okay, see you around.